He's on the verge of being that guy. The guy that rewrites the record books. The youngest to win, the fastest to gnome, and the quickest to four. 4 Iditarod championships, all before the age of 30.
It's been very rewarding for me and the dogs to be able to actually accomplish what we set out to do, to train that monstrous dog team. And it's something that my wife and I enjoy doing. We enjoy building this team, and it happens every day of the year for us when we're deciding which dogs to breed or how to train them or what supplements to use or which dog food. We spend a lot of time trying to do this well.
This was a race dominated by those 35 years and older for decades. Titles that were earned by veterans of a race that ripened by miles traveled over years down a trail that has evolved and morphs with the wind.
He'll have 20 more years of experience doing it, and he'll have come from 3 generations of people that taught him. I'm really good at this, but I'm not sure he's not better at this than me right now.
I have so much respect for all the competitors out there, and I don't race to beat Allie or race to beat my dad, and I think that's what's different. A lot of these mushers in the past that were great mushers, Susan Butcher, Rick Swinson, year after year, they race to beat each other. I don't race to beat these guys. I race to beat the trail. I race to build that monstrous dog team that's a joy to run across Alaska.
2012, he came from behind, conservative, old school-like, and he won at 25, the youngest ever. 2014, he found himself underneath the arch, unaware that he had won his second title.
Dude, Dallas, do you think you could do this?
Well, what exactly did I do?
You just won the Iditarod 2014.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, dude.
2015, his most dominant race. From the Yukon River in, his run times were blazing, and he won a third. 2016, he and his father battled to the final miles, and Dallas held him off to win his 4th championship in 5 years. He's run 10, his first 2 were non-competitive, and since then, he hasn't been out of the top 8 with 4 titles.
My gift is I'm good at being miserable. I really am. That's something that maybe it's my own warped way of coping. But when I wrestled, I was the guy who could drop 25 pounds and make weight and do it every time. And I took pride in being able to do it. I was a guy that wasn't worried or concerned about being miserable. 2-hour grind match, let's do it. And I learned early on or somewhere along the way that I am better at being miserable than most people.
Dallas was destined. It's been said before, he's got the right genetics. 3rd generation, his grandfather Dan helped organize the first race. His father Mitch dreamed of winning and has done so twice. And the knowledge and the experience has trickled down.
Dallas has energized and motivated a lot of people, if not the entire event. There's no better racer than Dallas. Dallas is a phenom. He brings all of the ingredients in a very young package with energy and intelligence, athleticism, and everybody needs to be stepping fast if they're going to keep up with him.
He may be the most hard-working polisher of his craft today. Like the legends before him, all had great dogs, but a willingness to work harder than their competitors galvanized their place in history. Dallas has been possessed and driven to win.
He's really good. He's going to be the guy to beat probably as long as he keeps running it. But I mean, it doesn't matter, how much you want to beat him or something. It's all the months before the race and all that. If you want to beat him, you're going to have to do something, put a lot of effort into it. Yeah, and I mean, I'm not saying you can even outwork him. It might take a pinch of luck, and probably more luck than he needs.
The question that looms, is the Dallas Seavey cycle slowing or even ending? There's a reason that 6 others have won 4 Iditarods, and only one went on to win a 5th championship. Is he the musher that breaks the trend? He'll be 30 just before the start of next year's race. Rick Swenson was in his 40s when he won his 5th.
I'm not going to say I'm going to race until I get 5 wins, or I'm going to race until I get 6 wins and break the record. I'm going to race as long as it's the most fun thing to do, because that's working for us. It's a backwards way of accomplishing all those goals by focusing on the aspects that we love. And yeah, it's very rewarding when you win the Iditarod on a team that is, in my opinion, second to none ever.
He's won with grace, a great sense of professionalism, a credit to the sport, to the race, and to his family. Dallas Seavey, a 4-time winner of the Iditarod sled dog race.
I hope we encourage other teams to do better. When you see, I know it's worked for me, when I see Jeff King run a beautiful race with a beautiful dog team, I know it's possible. And that encourages me to push harder. And that's the purpose of competition, isn't it? To push ourselves, not to begrudge the people who are beating you, but to realize that it is humanly or caninely possible to do that. Now go do it. Now go learn how to do it. Go learn something from what Jeff did. Yes, I got a trailer, but Jeff was running Seavey harnesses. We learn from our competitors. We build on that. So good competition breeds better dogmanship, and we have to trust that each other in the mushing world are going to be good sportsmen. And if somebody's going to say something, oh, Dallas Seavey, this, that, or the other thing, are they going to find a reason why they don't want me to win? Probably. But a lot of it will be just that.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dallas Seavey. All right, how y'all doing this afternoon? Everybody warm enough? Good golly, man. I left home and it was about 15 degrees out. Get down here and it is not 15 degrees out. So I understand that you guys are probably wondering, what in the world does racing sled dogs in Alaska have to do with what I do? I understand this is a world apart. But as we go through our stories here, I hope there are a few things that you can find that relate to what you do on a daily basis, and pick up a few things that might be able to help you along the way, and if nothing else, just have fun watching it. My family's been racing sled dogs for pretty much ever. My grandfather moved to Alaska in 1963 for the specific purpose of learning about sled dogs. Now, he promised my grandmother that they'd only be there for 2 years before they retreated to the relative warmth of Minnesota. Some 50-plus years later, my grandmother's still waiting for those 2 years to expire. I think she's finally given up hope on ever moving back, but this began my family's involvement with sled dogs. My dad grew up with dogs, and I grew up with dogs. Now, I was born at a very young age, so I don't specifically remember exactly how it played out, but I imagine it looked something about like this. One day I crawled out of a doghouse, had my coveralls on, picked up a shovel, started cleaning up after sled dogs. My family had about 100 sled dogs when I came into this world, and that's what we did. We started developing sled dogs, we started training sled dogs, but more importantly, these were my friends, these were my closest companions. Every single day I spent with sled dogs. My brothers and I were all homeschooled all the way through high school. Oh, I'm going to have a small correction here. My brothers and I were all home all the way through high school. The schooling part, we're not sure if that ever really happened or not. My mom wrote on a piece of paper, "You graduated," and I can't read it still, so I just think that's what it says. But anyway, so sled dogs were much closer to me than a pet or just a casual friend. These were my classmates. They were my best friends. And that was very important, I think, for my racing now, because I learned to see the world the way they did. I learned to understand things when my eyeballs were 2 feet off the ground as well as theirs. And now I have the ability to see the world the way they do. And when I lead a team, it allows me to help explain it to them, help them understand what we're doing, and be a better leader, understanding how my teammates see the world out there. The reason that we had 100 sled dogs, though, was, of course, the Iditarod. Now, we just watched a short video, and you guys kind of get a brief view of what the Iditarod is. How many people here was that the most mushing information that they've had up to this point in their life? All right. By the time you leave here, you are going to be big Iditarod fans, I hope. So the reason we had these dogs was the Iditarod. This is the biggest sporting event in Alaska. Growing up, every single year, my dad set out to win the Iditarod. Everything my family did was focused around winning this race. We started a tourism company to be able to finance racing, and there was never a doubt in our mind what the priority was. It was always racing. And then everything else that we did was to accomplish that goal. We need money, let's figure out how to make it. We need to overcome this obstacle or that obstacle. We're going to figure out one step at a time how to clear this hurdle. So growing up, I watched my dad year after year try to win the race. And every year we'd be hopeful going into the event, and halfway through the wheels would start falling off and he'd have another disappointing finish. And then after a couple years he got better at it and he was starting to work his way up the ranks, and it really gave us a lot of traction as we started more aggressively attacking that race every year. Finally, when I was 16 years old, my dad accomplished his lifelong dream of winning the Iditarod. It was his 11th attempt. And when I watched my dad run down the finish line and actually win this race after putting that many years of persistent effort to reach his goal, it definitely left an impression on me. More than anything, it was the realization that these people that I had grown up idolizing my entire life, people who won the Iditarod, were the toughest of the tough. These guys were superhuman. They were somehow different than me or my dad. We were trying our hardest, but not succeeding. So when he actually cracked the code and won the Iditarod, it was this realization that they are no different. They're made out of the exact same things. The only difference is mental. They kept just beating away at it. They were persistent, and they kept creatively solving one problem after the next and fixing the most important, most pressing issue each day along the way. And so that realization that I could do this, that I think set me down the path, and at that point I knew someday I would win the Iditarod. That was my dream, that became my goal. And this is what I imagined it would look like. This is a very iconic image here. This is my dad mushing down Front Street in Nome. There's thousands of people. He's seconds away from passing underneath the famous burled arches that marks the finish line of the 1,000-mile race. Then your lead dogs are wreathed in the yellow roses, and it's this big ceremony, and this is what you envision winning the Iditarod is. Unfortunately, the reality of winning the Iditarod is something a little more like that right there. My dad spent one day winning the Iditarod. He spent 4,000 days leading up to that victory being a musher, doing this every single day, solving the next problem, clearing the next hurdle, being disappointed, setting your goals long-term and short-term. That's what you have to enjoy. That's the part you have to be good at to someday accomplish that goal. Now, when I was 21, I decided that I was no longer going to be dreaming about winning the Iditarod, but now's the time. I want to set out and go win this race. So I left my family's kennel, started my own kennel, scraped together all the money I had, and convinced somebody to sponsor me, which was maybe a stroke of salesman genius right there, because I didn't exactly have a great racing resume at this point. I was going to be a new musher trying to be competitive for the first time. But we had got enough funding together to start collecting dogs. I had just recently been married, and at this point, I did not own a single piece of sled dog paraphernalia. Not one sled, not one dog, no property, not a single vehicle. And so to be able to get sponsorship, we had to push for something special. Not just, I want to race the Iditarod. Lots of people want to race the Iditarod. But I set the goal of becoming the youngest person to ever win the race. And this kind of fell in line because the first time I had run the Iditarod, when I was 18, I turned 18 the day before the race started. I ran a team of young dogs from my parents' kennel, not competitively, just to get experience for the dogs and develop those dogs. It's kind of our doggy college program, where they go through a whole year of training and running the race, but all of it's done at a very casual, relaxed pace to build confidence and develop the dogs physically. But it seemed like it was a little more than a coincidence that I happened to turn 18, the youngest you have to be to race the Iditarod, the day before the race started. My parents maintain it was a complete coincidence, but I'm still not convinced. Anyway, having been the youngest person ever to finish the race, it seemed logical. Why not shoot for the youngest to win it? Why not? Let's set the goal high. So to be able to do that, we set a bit of a long-term plan. 4 years would be our time frame to try to accomplish that goal. So in 2008, fall of 2008, the first thing I did was start acquiring sled dogs. Primarily, I was focusing on the long-term goal, which was to develop a kennel, a solid kennel that could be competitive year after year in the Iditarod as a career. The little bit shorter term goal within the next 4 years was to try to create a team that could actually win the race. So a lot of the dogs I bought, we were targeting very good genetics, but the individuals that we were able to buy, incidentally, were dogs that, well, lack of a better term, they had just been fired from their previous job. Every single dog on my team, that's the only thing they had in common is they had just been laid off. We had just enough money to buy 17 dogs, which you start the Iditarod with 16 dogs. So right away, we knew a few things. First of all, we were going to have to do everything differently, because the one thing that every dog on my team had in common was that they had proven they couldn't win on the traditional training styles. They couldn't succeed in the kennel that did everything the traditional way. But that gave us liberty and the freedom we needed to do everything differently, to experiment, and that gives us the experience we need and can use for years to come. Even if it's a mistake we made early on in our career when there was no pressure, and we can continue to learn from that for years down the road. The other thing that I knew about these guys was I had just enough to start the race. Generally, when somebody trains a team from a big kennel, 100 dogs, 150 dogs, there's going to be maybe 40 dogs that are really in this intensive training programs. Because of course you have the young guys, the yearlings, the 2-year-olds, then they join the racing team, then you have the retirees that are now professors rather than active racers. But they're going to have 30 to 40 dogs you're going to be developing, and the process of training is about selecting. This is the training process we're going to do, and I'm going to select the best 16. But when you only have 17 to work with, you know that every one of these guys is going to be on your team. So the question was about development. How do I develop each dog to their highest potential? And then how do we bring that together as a team that can be successful in the race? The first thing we started to adjust was the running and resting cycles. At this point in the mushing world, the trend was everybody was going farther and farther. And this was easier for the people, for sure. The mushers, the humans, would get a little more rest if they could do an 80 or 90-mile run nonstop with a dog team and then stop and take a 6 or 7 hour break. That gave them the 4 hours they needed roughly to get the dogs bedded down, take care of them. Then they would have a couple hours to get a nap and a few more hours of work to get the team ready to go again. But then because they're taking a longer rest, they would then do a longer run. But that's exactly what each of my dogs had proven was a problem for them, was doing those long hauls. So we dialed it back. We cut the runs in about half. We did 40 to 50-mile runs, and then also we're able to compress the resting lengths to make a much shorter cycle of running and resting. It was way more conducive to the dog's abilities and also their digestive systems, getting more meals in them more regularly. But the key here was we developed a program of training that was different than everybody else. At this point in mushing, everybody was training and doing a great big run. They would go out on Monday and do an 80 or 100-mile run with the dogs. And then they'd come home and take 3 or 4 days off and then go do it again. And this was a very convenient way to train a dog team. You could run primarily during daylight hours. You didn't spend night after night out on the trail. But to be able to figure out what our dogs needed to do, we had to train them the exact same way we were going to race them. Every day of training became a day of testing. We were testing new styles of developing the dogs, new feeding programs, and we tried to streamline absolutely everything. So our training program became a total immersion program. What it meant for me is that I spent every single night out on the dog trail somewhere, curled up underneath a spruce tree, shivering for 15 or 20 minutes, and then taking off again. So by compressing those cycles of shorter runs, shorter rest, it was great for the dogs because after just a 40 or 50-mile run, the dogs weren't tired. They'd roll into a checkpoint, and instead of thinking about sleep, food was a bigger priority. So they'd devour their meal, and then out of habit, they'd curl up and take a little nap. 4 hours later, they'd pop up and take off. This was great. The only problem is the 2 hours that I had taken out of the resting time was the 2 hours that I was supposed to sleep. But this is somewhere that we're going to have to rely on my aspect of being in the team, which is being a little bit younger than most of my competition. At this point, 21, the average age of a winning Iditarod musher was 42 because knowledge is more experienced than athleticism on the Iditarod. This is a coaching game. Look on the sidelines in the NFL. Most of the coaches aren't 21 years old. So how the Iditarod works is we take off, and it's entirely up to the musher, the human, how long we run, how long we rest. We can set those ratios for our dog teams the way we want. There are about 20 checkpoints along the way. And this is a standard-looking checkpoint right here, nothing fancy. We pull into a checkpoint, and we will have, before the race, sent out about 2,000 pounds of food and supplies across those 20 Iditarod checkpoints. So when I pull in there, there's a bale of straw for my dogs to rest on, and a couple bags of frozen meat and the dog's shoes and whatever else I decided to send to that checkpoint. Nobody can help the mushers do anything for their dogs, for their equipment, or to think, which becomes a very big part of the game later in the race, especially when you're only sleeping maybe half an hour to an hour and a half per day for a 9 to 10 day long event. We start with a 16-dog team, and at these checkpoints, the veterinarians, there are about 70 race veterinarians, they can help us look over the dogs, but they can't actually help administer any care. So if we find an issue with a dog, I can leave that dog behind. Then, of course, the vets can take care of them and fly him back home for me, but the team goes on with one less dog. You do not get a replacement, and you cannot get that dog back later in the race. So managing a team for the long haul becomes a big part of the game. So we started training, like I said, exactly how we were racing. Running and resting every single day in the same ratios, and this helped us fine-tune and dial in the ratios that worked best for the dogs. After we'd stopped down for a rest, of course, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cook up a meal for the dogs and feed them right away. And by having the dogs rested when they reach the checkpoint, again, they ate immediately. Some of these dogs that were doing a little bit longer runs, 80 or even 100 miles, when they reached the checkpoint, sleep was the higher priority. So they'd curl up, go to sleep, and then after about 2 hours, now they were rested back up enough to where now they're hungry. So then they would eat, and then they'd go back to sleep and need to sleep for about 4 hours to digest. But that first 2 hours of sleeping, they weren't digesting. It wasn't efficient use of time. So there's a very key aspect there by shortening those cycles to maximize every single second we were on the trail. Once the dogs eat their meal, this is when I go through and do my little veterinary exam on each dog. And this is a very brief process, generally speaking, because you're not going to have a dog that has a serious issue. So our veterinary exam consists of flexing the shoulders, making sure you have full range of motion, examining the paws to make sure there's no little cracks or any beginnings of rubs in between their pads if they've gotten a snowball in their booty or anything like that. We're going to put ointments in between their pads to keep their paws nice and soft as they're running down the trail. We're going to flex their wrist. And generally, this is a very quick process. You're going to do the flexation on each dog, and it helps stretch them out a little bit. One of the most important things is that the team knows that I'm aware of whatever's going on. There's always exceptions, though, right? So this particular dog right here, this is Crazy, and she's a very unique character, one of the best dogs on my team. But Crazy, every single time that either I flexed her shoulder or the veterinarians, as soon as we moved anything, she would let out this very pathetic little yelp and pull her leg back. And then the vet, their eyes would get big, because if a dog yelps, they should have been left behind 2 days ago. So then they'd check the other side, and she had the same very pathetic, ow, ow, ow. And then I'd go over and pick up her tail or pat her on the head, and she'd do the exact same thing. Somewhere along the line, she realized that if she was the one that let out a little bit of a whimper, she'd get the extra 20 minutes of massage and the liniments and the oils, then the special jacket with the heat packs in it to keep the muscles warm, then the blanket on top of her. 4 hours later, she'd pop up, shake off, and pull as hard as anybody else to the next checkpoint, and pull the same rouge again when we got to that checkpoint and saw new veterinarians. Once you get these guys bedded down, now it's my turn to do everything that I can for the team to help get us back on the trail as efficiently as possible and make sure that my team can just worry about what they need to worry about. And that's the key aspect here, is understanding that they shouldn't have to worry about anything but running happily down the trail. They should not have to worry, how long is this run going to be? Is this rest going to be long enough for me? When's the next meal coming? These types of things, they shouldn't have to worry about it. So on the Iditarod, the dogs are kind of our customers. We try to streamline everything for them so that it's as easy as possible. And time is our currency out there. So by training the same way that we raced, we fine-tuned all of these aspects. And this is where we started setting very short-term goals. Not where do I want to be in 4 years, where do I want to be in 10 years, but how do I streamline this 4-hour process to where I have 4 hours of work. If I can stop for only 4 hours, I need to streamline something so that I can get at least a 15 or a 20-minute nap in here. So we set goals, right down to every 30 seconds, trying to streamline that process. And I got very good at becoming very efficient in checkpoints because I practiced it every single day in training. I'd actually set up a tripod just like this one here with a camera in training. So I'd pull into a checkpoint, my fake checkpoint about 50 miles from my house, and I'd pull in, set up the camera, and then go to work. That way, when I came back after the run, I could look at every step I did during my training time to see where we could streamline, where we could make it more efficient. And as I was kind of racing myself in this process, I started asking myself a question thousands of times during each day out there, and what do I do next? Because when you get tired, you start getting bogged down. When you get tired on the Iditarod, you stop to think, and 20 seconds passes before you've had a single thought because your brain is fatigued, your body's fatigued, you haven't slept. So the question you ask is, what do I do in the next 10 seconds that's going to help my team? What do I do in the next 10 seconds that's going to keep this process moving? And it's just a way for me personally to keep pounding away at something and try not to think about the long-term goal for a few seconds. You sometimes have to focus down to right now, what can I do now to help myself get somewhere down the road? So after the dogs are bedded down, we get everything ready for the next run, then I have my chance for a short nap. Oftentimes I'll crash right on the straw next to the dogs. If it's above 0, I'm probably just going to lay down on the straw. I've got a very good parka snowsuit system, keeps me fairly warm. Below 0 down to 15, 20 below, I'm definitely going to get my sleeping bag out. My sleeping bag is very big, not very warm. It's rated to about 10 above. So it's more of just one more layer to go over the insulation that I'm already wearing. Some of the checkpoints do have buildings, which is really nice to be able to go inside, but you have to be careful. Because you go inside, and on the Iditarod, it might be 3 or 4 days since the last time you dried any of your gear. and you come into a checkpoint and you feel like out of habit, oh, I should hang my gloves up, oh, I probably should take my boots apart, take the liners out to dry them, I'm gonna hang my parka over here. Then you go to lay down and set your alarm clock and you realize you only have 20 minutes to sleep, so all of that was wasted time because nothing's gonna dry in 20 minutes. When your alarm clock does go off, you feel about like that, and trying to remember what you brought inside and what you hung up, and you realize that all the mushers have pretty much the same gloves out there, and trying to remember what's yours, and your brain's not working, trying to get all these things figured out is a huge waste of time. So this is another area that when I go into a checkpoint, I walk in and I lay down, I don't take anything off, I put an alarm clock on each side of my beanie hat and another one in the chest pocket in my parka. When they go off, I stand up and I walk straight outside and start taking care of the dogs. Generally, I start putting the booties on the dogs. In one race not so very long ago, I woke up and found myself putting booties on the dogs, and I look up and I had already bootied 6 of them, and I had no recollection of having woken up to getting to where I was. It's kind of like when you drive to work and you're like, wait, did I just drive here? I hope I didn't run anybody over. But this is where it's going to be uncomfortable, because when you wake up out there on the Iditarod and you're on day 7 and you're getting an hour of sleep a day, it is difficult to get moving, especially if you're inside where it's nice and warm. You start looking for excuses to procrastinate even for a few seconds. Just 3 or 4 more seconds of sitting down. You are so fatigued. It is the most painful part of being a musher. And then you walk outside and it is 30, 40 below zero and you have a strong wind, and the first task you have to do is start putting these booties on the dog's feet. Every single checkpoint, we put boots on the dog's feet. They run to the next checkpoint. We get to that one, we take all those booties off. It's a very time-consuming process. So this was another area that we saw a huge amount of inefficiency in just a standard day of mushing, because we put these booties on and off so many times, and it's very easy to start putting the boots on and you get 2 or 3 dogs done. Then you want to stop and warm up your hands. They get warmed up, you do a couple more dogs. This is where you have to grit your teeth and just get it done. By being more efficient, by being a little bit quicker in this process, I could afford a few more minutes of rest for my dogs, which pays dividends when we start running down the trail. It really adds up. Every second of extra rest you can get for your dogs, the better. So I spent a lot of time fine-tuning how I put the booties on the dogs, and also just being good at being miserable. You're putting the boots on, you feel the backs of your hands freezing as the wind's blowing across them, and you just grit your teeth and get the job done as quickly as possible. In the process of doing that and training this every single day, I got a style of booting dogs down that saved me 3 seconds per dog foot, which at first sight doesn't seem like a real big deal. I mean, I spent forever working on it. It was a little bit disheartening that after a year of practicing this, I was only saving about 3 seconds a foot. And then I did the math on it and realized that 3 seconds, you get 4 feet on a dog. Actually, all but one of my dogs has 4 feet. One of them only has 3 feet, but that's a long story for another day. So you got 64 feet in a dog team, multiplied by 3 seconds, multiplied by 20 checkpoints along the way, it comes out to about 64 minutes. So even that, what does 64 minutes mean? Well, looking back at my career now, this is some 8 years later from when I was first doing this, I now have 4 Iditarod wins. 3 of those have been won by less than an hour. That's the difference it makes, is 1 win versus 4 wins by streamlining one little process. And more than anything, it was deciding that I was going to be better at booting dogs than anybody else. And that's that extra oomph you need when your hands are freezing and you're exhausted and all you want to do is thaw your hands out for a couple seconds, but you power through it, you get the team done, and you get on the trail. It makes all the difference in the world to being able to power through those last few steps. So this style of training and developing the dogs and then how we were racing the dogs, it led us to have a very much a come-from-behind style of racing. Because we were taking so much more rest early in the race, we were betting that this team would be faster at the end. So we started to get a bit of a reputation for coming from behind at the end of races. 2009 was the first race that we ran with this team of dogs, and I had only had the team together for about 6 months. We started out, and the best bet from the analysts was that we would finish 20th place if everything went perfect for this team. That was going to be a win for this team, their best possible finish. And that year, we were running about 20th place most of the way. But as we started getting near the finish line, we started picking off one team after the next, because we were building a team through the course of the race, not racing the team to the finish line. In the last 300 miles, I moved up several positions, ended up finishing in 6th place, only 30 minutes behind my dad, who at this point had the longest running streak of top 10 finishes and was considered one of the top picks to win the race. We were very pleased with that finish. 2010, we took a step farther with this program, and we continued to set little goals that would help us reach the bigger goal. Little goals in every single process of how can we do this better, every single day, trying to streamline that, and kind of our mantra there became just We're going to do each aspect the best we possibly can, and the big goals will take care of themselves if we cover all the little ones step by step. 2010, I ran the Iditarod 2 hours faster than anybody in my family had ever run the race, including when my dad won the race in 2004. We were very pleased with that. Unfortunately, a lot of other people ran the race fast, so that would be my worst finish, and that was an 8th place finish. I was very happy, though, because I beat my dad in that race, and so that was a victory for myself. Terrible Christmas after that, but that's all right. 2011, we took it a step farther. 2011, everything went smoothly. It was a tough race, the type of race that I like, and we ended up breaking the record on the Iditarod Trail that year. Unfortunately, so did 3 other mushers, but I finished in the top 5 for the first time in a 4th place finish that year, and it was working. That was confirmation that this style works. Building a team works. That year, I think we picked off 10 teams in the last 300 miles of the race, and it became kind of fun for me to see how many teams we could pass. I had the highest average for how many teams I passed in the last 300 miles of the race of any team in the race. That's another thing we kind of took pride in. It was powering all the way through the finish line, building a team that was strong, that was powerful, that we were the aggressors. I'd rather be the hound than the rabbit every single time. 2012 finally rolls around, and this was going to be my last chance to be the youngest person to ever win the Iditarod. And this was also kind of the race that we had been developing this team for. The same group of dogs had run all these races with me, and they kept getting closer and closer and closer. And they became more and more confident, not in me necessarily as the leader, but in the structure of the team. As far as they're concerned, a leader is just another role that is played within the team. And they knew that this team was powerful, they did things together, and whatever task was in front of them, they could accomplish it. And that was the confidence that we developed with them. So everything was running quite smoothly in 2012, and I found myself for the first time in the lead of the race, 800 miles into the event. And we're crossing this open stretch of Bering Sea ice. This is actually a different year, but the same exact location, and you can see forever out there. Team was running fairly strong, and the temperature started dropping, and I started having a little bit of doubts about why am I already in the lead? We're only 800 miles into this event. Generally, I take the lead or hope to take the lead in the last 50 miles, perhaps. So a little bit cautious there, but the team was looking relatively strong. And as we started crossing the sea ice, wind starts kicking up a little bit. Temperatures are dropping a lot. It goes from being 0 to 10 below to 20 below, and you know it's going to be a cold night as the moon starts coming up and the temperatures start going down. And after about an hour after leaving the checkpoint, getting out on the sea ice, I see a couple lights appear behind me, and they're gaining on me somewhat quickly. So I started doing what I always do, pedaling with one foot and ski poling, just kind of alternating, a push with a leg, a push with a ski pole, pushing, and our speeds kept kind of slowing down. And because it is day 8 of the Iditarod, and you haven't slept, and you're frozen, and you're exhausted, and you become very pessimistic when you get very tired like this, you start having doubts, especially since we had done everything so differently than what everybody said we should do. And so as I'm pedaling and ski poling, and these lights keep gaining on me, it starts snowballing in my mind of, I overpushed the team, maybe I set the goals too high for this group, maybe we can't do this. I was trying to race those other teams and it became too much. I look behind me and the lights keep getting closer and closer, and again, you can see forever. It's like some pirate movie where you see the lights way in the distance and you know it's going to take them a day to catch you, but there's nowhere you can go. They're going to catch you sooner or later. So after a few more minutes of this and our speeds seem like they get going slower and slower, it finally got to be where I'd convinced myself there's no way I'm going to win this race. What's the point? Ended up sitting down on my sled and had I'll admit, a bit of a pity party for a couple minutes there. Just thinking that I had maybe pushed the team too hard. What did we do wrong? Why did I put myself out there and say, oh, I'm going to win the Iditarod? How foolish does that seem now that I'm getting passed by these guys who are going to say, told you so, as soon as they go by me? After about 5 minutes of this, it kind of started getting frustrating, and I figured, you know what? Yeah, they're going to beat me. They're going to catch me, but at least I'm going to make it as difficult as possible for them. And when I get to the finish line, I'm going to know that I did everything possible for this team to get us to the finish line as quickly as they can do, safely and healthily. So I stand up, start pedaling and ski poling, and I told myself I'm going to do everything I possibly can until we get to the finish line so that I will have that, be able to be content when this thing's all said and done. And that sounds all fine and dandy and glorious until you start pushing and ski pulling again, and the whole left side of your back locks up, so you switch to the right side and go over there for a couple minutes. And I started thinking, I'm going to go 10 more minutes, and then that's all I'm going to be able to do here, 10 more minutes. And pretty soon, after half an hour, 10 more minutes, there was no way. So I was thinking, I'm going to do one more step, one more step, one more step. I stopped looking over my shoulder at some point because it no longer mattered. I knew they were going to pass me. It didn't matter. This was no longer about the competition. It was about me and my dog team getting to know them as quickly as we possibly can and knowing that there's nothing that we could have done differently when it's all said and done. After a couple hours of doing this, I don't know how long, because I stopped looking at the watch, stopped looking behind me, one more step. Next thing I remember was waking up. Somewhere in there I had passed out over the front of my sled, dropped my ski pole, kind of stinks, those things are expensive, and I wake up to the sound of these two massive snow machines roaring by me, their bright headlights lighting up my whole dog team, startles me awake, and I look over and there's these snow machines pulling these great big sleds full of camera equipment. And as they go by, I look over my shoulder and there are no more lights behind me. What I'd been racing for the last 4 hours were two snow machines that in the far distance on the sea ice look exactly like a dog team. Because they had the big loads, they weren't going hardly any faster than a dog team. They were only going about a mile an hour faster than me. So they go by me, and now that I'm awake and looking around, I can see the lights at the next checkpoint only a few miles ahead and no lights behind me. So all of a sudden, my attitude turns 180 degrees. I went from thinking everything was going to fall apart and it was a total lost cause to this is actually going to work. I pull into the checkpoint, try to go through our routine as quickly as possible, get the dogs bedded down, get them fed, get the straw out there, do the vet care. I'm doing all this stuff, and now I am checking my watch. Half an hour goes by, nobody shows up. An hour goes by, nobody shows up. An hour and a half later, the next musher arrived. And we had had the fastest run time across that sea ice of any of the mushers. And yeah, it felt like we were going slow, and we were going slow, because at 40 below zero, runners don't slide on snow. The snow is very dry and abrasive, and it was tough for everybody. So yeah, it was hard for me. And what I was seeing as a slow team was the tough conditions, and it was difficult for us, but it was just as hard for everybody else out on the trail. So after we made it through that run, that was really the key turning point to this race. And it's almost humorous in hindsight to look back at the real turning point where our brightest moment in this entire race happened to be when I thought I was racing somebody else, but ultimately ended up racing myself and doing what was best for our team in that single section of the trail. 36 hours later, I actually get to live through my childhood dream of watching my team charging down Front Street in Nome. It was actually even a nice sunny day even, just to have the icing on the cake there. Running down Front Street in Nome, underneath the burled arch, lead dogs wreathed in the yellow roses, the little leader on the right-hand side there. That was actually probably the highlight of that whole event. That lead dog on the right-hand side with the roses, that's Guinness. And when I bought her, she was kind of the 17th dog because I didn't count on her to race. She was about 35 pounds, and everybody had told me, she's way too small to race, but she's got great genetics. That was the sales pitch, at least. So we had bought her as a breeding dog, but because we didn't have extra dogs, of course she got trained with everybody else, and she got developed with everybody else. And 4 years later, not only does she win the Iditarod, she gets nominated and then receives the MVP award, which is the highest honors a sled dog can receive. I think to this day, she is the smallest dog to ever receive the MVP award. But that was probably the highlight of that race for me, was watching a dog go from something that we just written off and watching how much you can develop a dog when you put that attention and energy into them. And then kind of the realization of how we accomplish this greater goal was by setting a million little goals along the way and overcoming each of those goals one step at a time. There's not much you can do about a goal 4 years from now that you can't do right now. Right now is the only time we can do anything about it. It's the next 20 seconds that's going to make the big difference. And knowing when to break your goals down and plan for the long term, and knowing when to focus on right now and not get overwhelmed by the idea that, yeah, these guys are going to pass me, so what's the point in fighting it if they're going to beat me anyway? That's not the question. The question is, what can I do in the next 10 seconds that's going to help my team to the best of their ability? Now, it's not always just mushing happily down the snowy trails out there. Every winter we cross about, I'd say on average, 200 to 300 rivers that we're going to cross over out there. And this is not what it's supposed to look like when you reach a river, by the way. And I just want to talk a little bit here about a portion of communication, I guess, but also a team structure. And just to take a few seconds back to explain what happened leading up to this point here. The musher, being taller than the dogs, sees this obstacle, and as they come up to the obstacle, tells the dogs to go straight across the river, but already there's a little trepidation in that musher's voice, because they know as well as any dog in that team that we don't handle obstacles very well. So the musher says, "Go straight ahead?" ? The dogs reach the front edge of the river, and they stop. The next dogs kind of run into the back of them, and now you have an accordion rather than a dog team. Now the musher stomps up there, grabs the dogs, and is bodily carrying them across the river, which the musher, being 4 times larger than the dog, is going to get them to the other side. But I'm pretty sure those 2 dogs being carried aren't saying anything nice about their leader right now. The next two dogs, I'm not a body language expert, but I'm pretty sure that's not the sign of cooperation right there. They have all 4 feet dug in, and they say, yeah, if you can drag me across, I'm going to go, but I'm going to do everything I can to stop us. The next one here, I like him, the one with his tail up. He's looking down the river, throwing out some other suggestions. Why don't we go down this way? Doesn't it look easier over there? He's probably right. Then you have the whole group of dogs in the middle that are just, tell me when you figure it out, tell me when you know where you're going, and then we'll go. And then personal favorite, all the way on the right-hand side, 180 degrees turned around. He's going back where they came from. Forget this. Now, let's compare this team to this team. Same exact obstacle, only way bigger, but this team mushes up to the edge of the river, and they have confidence in their team. The musher, which actually in this case, I hate to point this out because that's my dad, and he's doing a very good job of crushing this river right here. I got to this river several hours later. I was getting thoroughly beat on this race. My dad ultimately won the race, so by the time I got there was no cameraman left. They had gone to follow the winning mushers. So he gets to the edge of the river, tells the lead dog straight ahead, and of course they're going to go straight ahead because as far as they're concerned, anything that the musher says is possible. They know that they're going to jump in there, and they know that the next 2 dogs behind them are not going to throw the brakes on. And this one here, if the leaders jump in this water, I mean, there's a section in the middle of there where the lead dogs, or all the dogs, were actually having to swim, not a long stretch in the middle, but their legs weren't touching the ground. And if anybody behind them is digging in their feet, they're not going to be able to swim harder than those dogs can put on the brakes. But this team, because they're all doing it together, they plow on through, they come out the other side, nobody's even really tangled up, they shake the water off, and when they come to a river twice that size next time, they're going to know that this team handles obstacles well. We all do it together, we pile in, we come out the other side, everything's fine. This team, next time they can come to a trickle the size of a garden hose, and they're going to have the same exact reaction. They're going to know that this team does not handle obstacles well. This team needs to go all the way back to the most basic challenges and start to develop a history of success, clearing bigger and bigger hurdles until they are prepared to do something like this. Once you develop a team that can do this, it really doesn't matter what the challenge is. You can't prepare for every possible challenge, but you can prepare a team that is good at handling challenges. This became incredibly important in the 2014 Iditarod. We started out the race on bare dirt. They almost changed the course in the Iditarod because going over the first mountain range, the Alaska range, there was only about 6 inches of snow. It's supposed to be impassable with less than 12 feet of snow. But there was snow in the forecast, so they decided to go ahead and go over the mountain range. A day before the race, instead of the forecasted snow, it came as freezing rain. Melted what little bit of snow we did have and left somewhat glazed ice and rock-solid frozen dirt. And we spent a lot of time on our sides. And the first 300 miles of the race, 30% of the mushers dropped out of the race. Some of them had broken bones, some of them just had broken sleds, but it was overwhelming. It was too much to think that they had 1,000 or 700 more miles of this to go through, and they just pulled the plug and will come back next year. And just a side note, mushers, other mushers, not myself of course, but they do tip over on occasion out there. So there's a certain procedure when this happens. If you tip over, generally it's going to be in snow, and you have to hang on. This is the #1 rule of mushing, is you do not let go, because these dogs love to run. And they love me too, but they love running more. So if I let go, they're just going to keep on trucking down the trail, and they're going to say, well, if you can catch up, you're welcome to come along. So when you tip over, you hang on, your park is going to get packed full of snow, and because of all the friction of the sled on its side and you on your side, it'll slow the team down. Then you can flip your sled back upright, and then this is a very important step. You look around and you make sure nobody saw you tip over. Then you dump the snow out of your parka and continue down the trail. But this was a treacherous race right from the get. Sleds were sent home in pieces. That's actually 7 sleds stacked up on top of each other. Just one after the next was getting crushed out there. It was brutal for the mushers. After the 3rd day of the Iditarod, every musher out there was saying this was the worst day of mushing, or the worst days of mushing that they had ever had, the worst terrain they had ever been in. The race then continued like this for the next hundreds of miles. It actually was a very, very fast race, because once we got out of the mountains, there was no resistance for the dogs. The trail was glazed ice. So this was now not only a brutal first couple days of the race, but we were now running at a record-breaking pace. It was just insane, the distances and the speeds that the mushers were able to do. And because of this, and my come-from-behind style of racing, I found myself very beat up, very tired, and instead of being 6 hours behind the leaders with 300 miles to go, I was 10 hours behind the leaders with 300 miles to go, which pretty well put me out of contention. But we focused on getting this team to the finish line as quickly as possible, and we figured the worst of it was behind us. At this point, 700 miles of the worst trail I'd ever been on behind us. How much worse can it be from here to the end? I was a bit wrong on that. So in the last 300 miles of the race, we did start to close the gap. I left the last checkpoint of White Mountain. It's only 70 miles from the finish line, and I'd gone from being 10 hours behind to only 3 hours behind. So I felt pretty good about closing that much of the gap, but I was still in third place. First place was 3 hours ahead of me. Second place was 2 hours ahead of me. And my dad, fortunately, was in fourth place behind me, and he was 2 hours behind me, so I felt relatively comfortable that he wasn't going to catch us in the final miles. And we take off from the last checkpoint, and we're mushing through the hills, and then I stopped and took this picture just very briefly because it didn't turn out all that great, unfortunately, but the sea ice, that's supposed to be white as far as you can see. Instead, there's this little ribbon of sea ice, and then all the darkness up there is just open seawater. That's the Bering Sea right there, and it is very cold, and the wind was howling. Up here on the mountains, I figured it would be a little bit worse than down once we got along the coast. You can see some of the dog jackets are blowing in the wind. It was a 25, 30 mile an hour wind here. Great sunset. It was awesome with the waves out there, so I snapped a picture and then took off down the hill. Again, it's 2 hours to the team in front of me, 2 hours to the team behind me. I didn't feel like I was under any real pressure in this last run of the race. We went down the hill, and probably about 6 minutes after this picture was taken, I went around the last foot of that hill and out to the open sea ice and got crushed by about a 90 mile an hour gust of wind. It laid every single dog on its side. It flipped my sled over and then barrel rolled me, and I ended up sliding sideways, me and the dogs, on the ice until we hit a patch of snow that was wind-blown and hard-packed. The dog's claws sunk in, and we all stopped. And then this gust continued to blow for another 30, 40 seconds. And then the gust of wind lets up, and now we have a steady 40-mile-an-hour wind. I'm a little stunned. The dogs are a little stunned. I talked to Beetle, who's the lead dog up there right in the front of this picture, and he stands up, leans into his harness. The next two dogs follow suit. The next two dogs, we all stand up, go into the wind for about 100 yards, then turn back sideways to the wind to go the direction we need to go, make it about 100 yards, and the next gust of wind hits us, blows us over, slides us across the ice. We stop, we get up, we repeat. After doing this for about an hour, we had started getting into some serious driftwood that was blown up on the beach pushed up on the beach by the waves. And so now each time that we blew over, we'd keep sliding, and then we'd hit a chunk of driftwood, and the team would just kind of fold around it, and I'd have to first untangle Beetle and have him stand, lean into the wind. And this was quite amazing, honestly, because every instinct in the dog is screaming, curl up and put your tail over your nose and lay here until this wind stops. And I'm asking him to stand leaning 40 degrees into this wind and hold the line tight, not just for a few seconds until we can start to go, but while I untangle the next section of dogs that are all stuck in the branches of the driftwood, and then untangle the next group and the next group, and then get on my sled and get it untangled and start moving. If at any point even one of these dogs decided that they were going to lay down, that's all it takes to stop the whole team. This team's only as strong as the weakest link. So we get untangled one time after the next, and I caught myself about an hour and a half into this thinking, we've got 40 miles to go to get off this beach to the finish line. There's no way we're going to make it. And that's when I started thinking, and I kind of fooled myself to believe that this is the area they call the blowhole. It's supposed to only be a couple miles wide, even though we'd already done numerous miles in here. So I'm thinking, we got to come out the other side at some point. So we focused on, we're going to get up and we're going to scurry as fast as we can, and we're going to go 100 yards until we get hit by the next gust of wind, blown over, and then we're going to stop, and then we're going to do it again. Just 100 yards at a time, one shot at a time. We kept doing this for hour after hour after hour. Finally, we reached the far side of the beach and got into a little bit more sheltered stuff. Now it was just a steady 40 mile an hour wind, and we were able to get cruising along, and we were all a little shell-shocked. And I figured this got to be the textbook way to finish a race that's been so brutal the entire time, to wrap it up with one of the strongest storms that they'd ever recorded on the race. Afterwards, I find out that the trail breakers, the people who are supposed to put the markers out in the trail, they'd given up putting markers out there because they kept blowing away, and there was no snow to stick it in anyway. But they have about 800-pound snow machines, and twice those snow machines blew over when they were parked. And apparently it happened a few more times. If they'd catch any air going off a mogul and a gust of wind hit them, it'd flip them over. So I don't know how strong of a wind that is. Well, after getting through the worst of the storm, I'm getting closer to town. We only have 5 or 6 miles to go now. And I look over my shoulder. I'm not really sure why, and I see a light behind me, which is very concerning. And at first, I think it must be a snow machine. And then I recognize a very distinctive head bob where the light's moving up and down, exactly what happens when a musher is pedaling on the side of a sled. And in my very sleep-deprived and exhausted mind, the only thing that comes to me is that somehow my dad had made up 2 hours from the last checkpoint through the storm and is now right behind me. And he's a wily old guy, so I mean, I don't know if he's put skates on his sled or what he's done to be able to keep his sled tracking straight, but either way, we need to do a push for the last few miles here. So I whistle up the dogs, and 6 out of 7 start pulling real hard, and they're doing great. Number 7, he's happy as a clam. He led me through portions of this storm, helping Beetle out. Only a 2-year-old dog, and he's happy every time we stop, but his legs are only going 8 miles an hour. So when the rest of the team's ready to go 9 miles an hour, his legs still only go 8 miles an hour. So I stop, and I pick him up and put him in my sled. Now we got 6 dogs on the ground, and we start scooting along, and as soon as we whistle them up now, and this is a real eye-opener for me. After everything this team had been through, they get up to 9 miles an hour, 9.5, and we're holding right even. The team behind me, I can see the eyeballs of the dogs behind me now. I don't see who it is, but I know in my mind it's my dad. He's the only person behind me. So I race him all the way to the finish line, and the last few miles of the race, there are hundreds, I know that's not a big number, but this is Nome, Alaska, right? That's a lot of people. This is like 20% of the population. People is everywhere out there, and it's a lot of hubbub, and at first I'm thinking, why is everybody out here at 4 in the morning in a hurricane? And then it kind of dawns on me, well, everybody loves a close finish in the final miles of the Iditarod. It doesn't matter if it's 20th place. If it's going to be a photo finish, people come out to watch it. Secondly, everybody loves the father-son rivalry. So they're out there either rooting for my dad to show that young guy how it's done or show that old guy how it's done. So we're running up Front Street in Nome, and it's just more people than I've ever seen at the finish of the race. We stumble across the finish line. Beetle's just doing his thing in lead. You can see little Reef, his eyeballs poking out of the sled there. And I walk up to my first dog, Glitter, who incidentally is the daughter of Guinness, the one who won the MVP award there. She's just licking me on the face, happy as can be. I'm petting her, pretty well exhausted at this point because I was bundled up in my park and all the clothing, try to stay warm in a 90-mile-an-hour gust of wind. And then I end up sprinting the last 7 miles and never bothered to take any of those layers off, so I'm completely soaked in sweat. And that's when the camera guy asked me, did you think you could do it? And at this point, I'm starting to wonder, do what? He says, dude, you just won the Iditarod. This completely makes no sense to me because I knew that there was 2 teams ahead of me, and 3 hours ahead of me, 2 hours ahead of me. Pretty soon the whole story starts to unravel. The 2 teams in front of me didn't make it. They get into the storm, and sure enough, they got blown over 1 too many times, and on top of being the worst 3 days in the beginning of the race that any of us had mushed in, and then a record-breaking pace, which was pushing the limits for both the mushers and the dogs the entire way, and then that last straw, the last storm was just enough to shut them down. The first place musher, his dogs kind of made the call. One of those times when they got wrapped around a chunk of driftwood, one of them listened to their instincts and covered their nose up with their tail, and he walked about 4 miles to the next station out there, got a snow machine and some people to help him, and they come and they loaded up the dogs and took them to the checkpoint, and as soon as you accept outside help, you're out of the race. The other musher actually made it to a shelter cabin, and she was so startled by the experiences out there that she was no longer worried about racing. I'm just stopping. This was just too much. It was too much to expect. And she was thinking that there's 30 more miles to go in this, not 100 more yards to go in this. So we made it through the storm thinking that we were just trying to make it out alive and there was nobody to race until we were already through the storm. Now the musher that was at that shelter cabin, when she saw me go by, it was just enough to realize this is possible, this is doable, we can make it. So she went out, got her dogs hooked up, and by the time she caught up with me, well, she was able to catch up with me because I was hoody-doing along, didn't realize I was racing anybody. But once she caught up, we were able to stay even as she pulled in only 2 minutes and 22 seconds behind me. It's the second closest finish in Iditarod history. My dad pulled in a few hours later. He was actually about 2.5 hours behind me at the finish line, finished 3rd place. And this was another eye-opening experience that, again, it's just making it that one more step. All it took, the person who ended up finishing 2nd, it was handed to him on a silver platter. They had a 2-hour lead, and the musher in front of them dropped out. All they had to do was make it. But it was just that one extra difficulty that was more than what you could expect to handle. That one extra difficulty, and that was, how I see it, it's an excuse. You're offered an excuse, and you choose to either accept it or you don't. And those excuses are going to come 1,000 times. And this was a very viable excuse, don't get me wrong. 90-mile-an-hour winds are a pretty reasonable reason to shut a team down. Anyway, it was a very neat experience to actually win a race and then find out you won it afterwards. But it brings home the point that it really is your team that you're driving. And then after that, every race that we started running, we stopped worrying so much about the competition. and has stopped worrying about racing other teams. And it's run this team to the best of their ability every single step of the way, and that does give you the best shot at winning the race. What if it was a blind race? What if we each were running on separate trails and we didn't know what our results were until the race was over? Would that change how we race? I really think it would sometimes. I think sometimes because we have the competition out there, we try to beat them early in the game, but don't have the fuel later. So we have to ration for the entire 1,000 miles. But also, when you are beating another team, even if it's only by 2 minutes and 22 seconds, that's good enough. But the question really should be, could I do better? Could I do a little bit better? What's possible? And that's what we try to start focusing on. After this race, yes, we won it. That's great. But I had to be honest. Had the race been a little bit more normal, we would have come in third place. This was a fast race, and it proved that fast races were our weakness. So now we got to solve that problem. How do we solve the problem? I have a power team, not a speed team. I've got a great third gear dog team, but we don't do fifth gear very well. I don't like letting them go 14 miles an hour because I feel like it's too high risk of injury when they're running at that speed, at least for my type of dogs. So when it's a fast race, I can't maximize that easy trail. So that became the next question. How do we maximize an easy trail? How do I improve my team? Not worrying about how do I race against these guys? How do I beat Jeff King? How do I beat my dad? How do I improve on my team? The answer to that question came in a trailer. I figured, how do you combine a speed team or a power team to maximize an easy trail? Well, quite simply, by adding a trailer to my sled, it allowed me to actually put 2 dogs in the trailer, 2 dogs in my sled. Now I've got 4 dogs riding, and I only need 12 to pull because it's an easy trail. This extends our range. Now, instead of doing 50 miles, I can do a 70-mile run. Each dog rides for a quarter of the time because I'm carrying a quarter of my team at any given moment. So each dog only runs 53 miles, but the team traveled 70 miles. This is how we maximize a fast trail with a power team. So we implemented this as a way of kind of self-improvement. Not how do I beat these competitors on a fast race, but how do I have this team, how do I set the team up to do better on a fast trail? How do we be more competitive and get to the finish line faster when it's an easier trail? By using the trailer, I think quite effectively, 2015, I won the Iditarod by 4 hours. One of the largest margins of victory that there's been in many, many years. Immediately after that race, my dad started texting me and calling me on the design on my trailer. So the next year, he was bringing that to the game as well. But after winning it by 4 hours, at this point, I wasn't going to say, okay, we've got it figured out. We're in front. I've got a comfortable lead. I've got it dialed in. I'm not going to change anything. It's still, how do I improve this team? What can we do differently? And for the first time, there wasn't an immediate problem that had to be solved. So I could actually look long-term and ask the question, where's this sport going to be in 10 years? What's going to be done differently? And the biggest thing that kept coming to mind was how we train the dogs right now. Even though we completely rewrote how we trained them, we still stuck to the preconceived notion of a 6-month training season. That is, it gets cold enough on September 1st or thereabout to actually start training the dogs. These are an Arctic breed dogs. They got a pretty fluffy coat. So in the summertime in Alaska, it does get warm, and we can't really train them. So the style of training was always between September 1st and the end of February. That was your training season. And everybody did it, and everybody took it for granted, so nobody saw it as a disadvantage, therefore no need to change. But what if we had a 9-month season to train? What if we had a 12-month season to train? What would that change on how I could develop each dog? If we can do this much development with little Guinness in 6 months, what could we do over a longer period of time? And the first thing that came to mind is I can give them more rest in between our big training sections. Because my style of training puts us out there for 4 or 5 days at a time, I want to be able to give them 10 or 12 or 15 days off in between these big training sections, and I can afford more time if we start sooner. But now we can quantify the question, and that is, how do we train more months out of the year? Now it's easy to find the answer. A 53-foot refrigerated trailer with a 50-foot treadmill inside of it. I live in Willow, and we had a lot of 80-degree temperatures this summer. And so we implemented this after the 2015 race, and it would be 80 degrees outside, and I could have it at about 35 to 40 degrees inside, and can run 14 dogs as long as I want at any time of day, all summer long. So we started using this, and my dad and I, as much as we're bitter rivals on the Iditarod, we're actually pretty good friends too, and it's kind of hard to hide a 53-foot trailer in your front yard. So we live about 5 hours apart, which is almost far enough. But so he immediately, realized what was going on, and I talked to him about it after I had it there, and he spent the first 2 weeks trying to convince me it was a terrible idea, and I think mostly he was trying to convince himself, like, oh man, I don't have to do this now too, do I? He had just got done building a trailer. So he lives in a little bit cooler climate, it's a little bit wetter, and he went and bought about 120 little kiddie swimming pools. And he set those pools out alongside his dog trail, so every mile his dogs can lay down in the water and get wet, and he can go another mile. So this last summer, my dad and I, or I guess it was the summer of 2015, my dad and I were training all summer, him in his own fashion, me in my treadmill. Come the 2016 Iditarod, I won the race by just 40 minutes over my dad. He had almost a carbon copy sled or trailer of mine, had been training all summer just like we had been, but we do kind of communicate and work together a little bit. We don't share dogs, we share limited information. But he finished 40 minutes behind me this last year, and much of the way it looked like he was going to get me, and we pulled out the last few miles, we got a little bit of a lead. But the interesting thing was, we were 7.5 hours ahead of third place. That was a massive lead. And this is what happens when you start trying to see how much better you can do. Not what is it going to take to beat the competition, but what is it going to take to improve my team? How do I keep improving? It's not who's as good as they were last year. It's who's improved the most since last year. Even if you're top of the charts one year, you're not going to stay there long if you don't keep improving, you don't keep innovating. And from my brother's standpoint, it was very interesting. When I got the treadmill, the first thing he said is, why would you change anything? You just won, this was in 2015, you just won your third Iditarod, you had a 4-hour lead, why would you change anything? And it took me a while, actually, honestly, to answer that question. Why are we changing it? And then I realized the reason that we won 3 Iditarods is because we were changing. We got good at innovating, we got good at developing it, and we got good at pushing ourselves and being willing to take that risk and step out of our comfort zone and get rewarded for it. And we're going to make mistakes. We're going to make some epic mistakes if we keep changing, sure. But as long as we win more battles than we lose out there, we're going to keep improving. And if I do make a mistake, at least I have that information now, and my competitors or everybody else, they're going to have to make that mistake at some point to have the knowledge that I now have. So the goal is to keep improving your team, keep improving yourself, to try to figure out how to develop on that. And I love having the competitors out there. I love every single one of them. Allie Zirkle is an amazing dog racer. She's finished second to me twice and second to my dad once. So she really shouldn't be a big fan of Seavey's right now. But she's one of my favorite mushers out there because she is much the same. She's a very intuitive dog driver, and I think she tries to develop her team to the best of their ability. She's a very good friend. My dad is, like I said, he's my best friend. Yes, it's very competitive. We're not helping each other. We definitely want to beat each other. My dad wants nothing better than to win the Iditarod one more time. But it changes how you race these people when you care about these people. It's easy to race somebody. If I hated him, and it's like, oh, I just got to beat him, it's easy to do this stuff. But when it's somebody you really care about, it makes it a lot harder, and it makes you race for the right reasons. And I think because of that, we do better because we are racing to develop ourselves, to improve on our own performance, and not to try to beat somebody else. I don't begrudge them if they have a great race. If I don't have the best team and somebody else does, kudos to them, good work. Now we're going to figure out how we need to develop ourselves, and it might be in a different way than they develop. But that's the fun part, is because you can beat all the other competitors in the race, sure, but you can always improve on yourself. So there is no limitation to the development that we can do. You can never master this sport. You're never as good as you can possibly be. So you can always keep working towards something. And I think that is part of the reason that this is a very addictive sport, and I'll probably likely be doing this for the next very long time. So on that note, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to our stories here. Hopefully you know a little bit more about mushing than you did a while ago, maybe a little more than you ever hoped to know too. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to me and having me down here. This has been great. Thank you, Myron, for having us, and I will take my leave. So thank you. Does anyone have one question for Dallas? One question. We're a little short on time. All right. Yes, ma'am.
When the doubts started to come in your mind, what do you think it was that caused you to turn that around and have the strong mindset?
Doubts are always there, especially when you do things differently. It's easy to do things exactly the same as everybody else. Had I trained in a traditional manner, I think it would have been easier because then I have excuses. And I see this a lot of times in racers, and it's something that holds them back, is they race to be able to explain why they didn't win, or race not to lose rather than race to win. And they're not willing to put it all on the line. But when you do put it on the line, yeah, there's a lot of mistakes I could have made. So the doubt comes from, first of all, pessimism is a huge aspect of sleep deprivation. That's a documented aspect. But to answer your question directly, like how do you turn that around? I think the question is, don't try to handle the entire problem. Every single 1,000-mile race has been won one step at a time. It's been lost one step at a time. And as soon as you start looking at everything that has to be done, everything that needs to be done to accomplish your goal, how far there is that you still have to go, it becomes overwhelming. And it's enough that starts crushing you, and then you just look for something, an excuse, an out. There's some reason I can justify it. It's just too much to handle. And that's understandable. When you look at everything that has to be done, how can I possibly do all this? But if you look at what can I do in the next 10 seconds? What can I do right now? And then for me, it was actually more of a relief to know that I will be free of this. All I have to do is keep pedaling and ski pulling until I pass out. That's all I got to do. Now your mind's out of it, and it becomes a physical thing. And that's it. Then you can be content. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Dallas.
Absolutely.
And thanks, everyone, for coming.